In the spring of 2019, a recording began circulating online. The setting was a house in Woodland Hills, California, a quiet cul-de-sac in the San Fernando Valley, the kind of street where nothing is supposed to go wrong. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs from a television set, framed images of a woman in a red uniform seated at a Starship console. NASA memorabilia sat on shelves. Fan letters and artwork, accumulated over decades, filled the rooms. And on the recording, over all of it was a sound. An elderly woman screaming, not in anger, in fear, her voice breaking at a pitch that belonged to someone who did not understand what was happening to her and could not make it stop. The woman was 86 years old. Her name was Nichelle Nichols. For most of America, that name meant one thing. It meant Uhura, the groundbreaking officer on the bridge of the Enterprise, the role Martin Luther King Jr. himself had urged her never to leave. It meant NASA recruitment films and astronaut pipelines and a lifetime spent representing what the country could become. It meant dignity. It meant composure. It meant the future. The sound on that recording did not belong to any of those things. This is the story of how the woman behind one of the most iconic roles in American television spent her final years inside a battle she could no longer understand. A fight over her home, her money, her body, and her name, waged by the people closest to her, in courtrooms and tabloids in a small town in New Mexico, 800 miles from the life she built. But that sound, that voice, stripped of composure, stripped of the dignity that had defined an entire career, did not come out of nowhere. To understand how Nichelle Nichols ended up at the center of a fight she could no longer narrate for herself, you have to go back decades to the life she spent building something most people never manage. Not inherited wealth, not a family fortune passed down through generations of American industry. Something harder to protect and infinitely easier to dismantle. A reputation so powerful it had become a kind of public property, claimed by millions of people who had never met her, while the woman herself grew older and more vulnerable inside a house full of evidence that she had once changed the country. This is the story of how that woman, barrier breaker, icon, cultural institution, spent her final years inside a legal and personal battle over who controlled her body, her home, her money, and her legacy. It is not the story of Uhura. It is the story of what happened when the woman behind Uhura could no longer speak for herself, and everyone around her insisted they were the one who should. Nichelle Nichols was born on December 28th, 1932, in Robbins, Illinois, a small, predominantly black suburb south of Chicago that had been incorporated just a few years before her birth. Her given name was Grace Dell Nichols. Robbins was not a place that produced television stars. It was a working class community, self governing and proud, one of the earliest majority black municipalities in the northern United States, but without the kind of institutional infrastructure or industry connection that launched entertainment careers. What it gave Nichelle was something less tangible and more durable, a sense that black self determination was not abstract theory. It was the town she grew up in, it was the neighbors on her street. It was the reality of a community that had decided to govern itself, and the knowledge that such a thing was possible even when the larger country disagreed. She moved into performance early. By her teenage years, she was singing and dancing, and before she turned 20, she had performed with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, not as a featured soloist, but as part of the ensemble, a young woman from Robbins moving through the same rooms as one of the most important musicians in American history. That proximity shaped her sense of what a black artist could aspire to. It did not, however, spare her from the ordinary grind of a career in entertainment in the 1950s and early 60s, when opportunities for black women in Hollywood were narrow, repetitive, and frequently degrading. Nichols worked nightclub circuits, appeared in small theater productions, and took whatever screen roles were available, which meant that for years, her talent exceeded her visibility by a wide margin. By the early 1960s, she was living in Los Angeles, a working actress with a modest but persistent career, a brief marriage to a dancer named Foster Johnson behind her, and a young son, Kyle, to raise largely on her own. She was 33 years old when the audition came that would change everything. By then, she already knew what it meant to work without a safety net, to build a career from persistence rather than privilege, and to understand that fame, if it ever arrived, would be something she had earned mile by mile rather than inherited. There is something about that foundation worth understanding before the rest of the story can make sense. The woman who became one of the most recognized faces in American science fiction was not born into the entertainment world. She was not a child star groomed for celebrity. She was not a socialite who drifted into acting. She came from Robbins, Illinois, and she got to the bridge of the enterprise the way working class black actresses got anywhere in the 1960s, through talent, stamina, and a willingness to show up for auditions that might lead nowhere. The mythology that would later surround her name sometimes obscured that foundation. Nichelle Nichols was not a symbol first, she was a performer first. The symbolism came later, and it came because she did the work. When Gene Roddenberry cast her as Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek in 1966, the role was groundbreaking in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of the 21st century. Uhura was not a servant. She was not comic relief. She was not a singer in a nightclub scene, the kind of role black women were routinely offered and routinely expected to accept with gratitude. She was a senior officer on a starship, fourth in command of the bridge, handling communications for the flagship of a fictional but aspirational future. On American network television in 1966, a black woman holding authority on screen, wearing the same uniform as her white colleagues, and being treated as competent, essential, and unremarkable in her competence was not just unusual. It was almost without precedent. You have to understand what that meant in context. The year the show premiered, the Civil Rights Act was 2 years old. The Voting Rights Act was 1 year old. Watts had burned the previous summer. In Mississippi, organizers were still being murdered for the crime of registering black voters. And into that cultural landscape walked Uhura, calm, professional, unquestioned in her rank. And the effect on viewers, particularly black women and girls, who had never seen anything like themselves on a television screen in a role that assumed their dignity, was immediate and lasting. Fan letters arrived. Strangers stopped Nichols in public. The response was not just enthusiasm, it was relief. Someone had finally imagined them into the future. Nichols herself nearly walked away after the first season. She was frustrated by the limitations the writers placed on Uhura, by the sense that the character was being given less and less to do as the show continued, and she had a Broadway opportunity waiting that promised real creative latitude. The story of what happened next has been told so many times it is hardened into legend, but its emotional utility for what follows is impossible to overstate. At an NAACP fundraiser in 1967, Nichelle was introduced to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He told her he was a fan of the show. He told her his family watched it together, that it was one of the only programs they allowed the children to stay up late for. And then he told her she could not leave. His argument was not about her career. It was not about money or opportunity or the pragmatics of Hollywood. It was about what her presence on that screen meant for the country. He told her that for the first time on television, black people, black children especially, could see themselves in the future and not as servants or entertainers, but as professionals in a world that assumed their belonging. He told her that her role mattered, that Star Trek was one of the only shows he and Coretta allowed the children to watch, and that her departure would send a message she did not intend. That the future, even in fiction, did not include them after all. Nichelle stayed. She later said it was the conversation that changed the trajectory of her life. She also said she cried after it because she understood what King was telling her, that her career was no longer entirely her own. From the moment that conversation happened, Nichelle Nichols' professional decisions were fused with a public mission that transcended show business. She was no longer just an actress weighing job offers. She was a symbol, and symbols do not get to choose when they stop working. That fusion between the person and the meaning the country attached to the person would stay with her for the rest of her life. It made her iconic. It also made her vulnerable in ways that would not become visible for decades, when the country still wanted the symbol, but the woman behind it needed something far more practical than reverence. After Star Trek ended its original run in 1969, Nichols could have faded into the nostalgia circuit and nothing more. The show had lasted only 3 seasons. Residuals for the original cast were negligible. The contracts were products of the era, And none of the actors had the leverage to negotiate for the kind of back end compensation that would later become standard. But Nichols did not fade. Instead, she found a second act that extended her symbolic role into something concrete and measurable. In the late 1970s, she began working with NASA to recruit women and people of color into the astronaut corps. The space shuttle program was coming, and NASA's applicant pool looked like a country club. Overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly drawn from the same military academies and engineering departments that had always supplied the space program. Nichols threw herself into the effort with a conviction that went beyond celebrity endorsement. She appeared at recruitment events around the country. She made films for NASA. She used her fame and her credibility. The woman who had played a starship officer now telling young engineers and scientists that the real program was hiring and it wanted them to argue that the future she had represented on television ought to exist in reality. The results were measurable and historic. Among the astronauts who applied during that recruitment wave and were ultimately selected were Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, Judith Resnick, who would later die aboard the Challenger, Guyon Bluford, the first African American in space, and Ronald McNair, who would also be lost on Challenger. Nichols did not fly. She did something arguably more consequential for the institution itself. She changed who was allowed through the door. That second career, the NASA work, the advocacy, the convention appearances that kept the Star Trek connection alive for new generations of fans, built the public Nichelle Nichols that the country would celebrate and remember. But it also built something physical, something grounded in real property and accumulated objects, and that physical reality would become the most contested terrain in the final chapter of her life. By the early 1980s, Nichols was living in Woodland Hills, a quiet, leafy neighborhood in the western San Fernando Valley, known for its wide streets and family homes rather than for the kind of celebrity excess associated with Beverly Hills or Bel Air. She purchased a home there in 1982, and over the following decades, it became a kind of personal museum, not in the sterile, curated sense, but in the way that a woman who had lived an extraordinary life fills her rooms with evidence of it. The walls held photographs from the Star Trek years, production stills, cast portraits, images from press junkets and premieres. Fan memorabilia accumulated across decades of convention appearances, gifts, letters, artwork, and objects pressed into her hands by people who wanted her to know what Uhura had meant to them. NASA artifacts sat alongside acting awards. There was a guest house on the property, and in 1994 she acquired the neighboring lot for additional workspace and entertaining. Roses grew in the yard. The furniture was oversized and comfortable. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, private without being fortress-like, the home of a woman who wanted sanctuary but had never felt the need to disappear. The effect of walking through that house was the effect of walking through one woman's life, compressed into domestic space. Every room held evidence of a career that had mattered, not just professionally, but civically and culturally. The Woodland Hills property was not a mansion in the traditional dynasty sense. No gates, no staff of 20, no ancestral portraits and gilt frames. It was something more personal and ultimately more vulnerable. The physical record of a self-made American life, built by one woman's labor, talent, and decades of refusing to disappear. It was Nichelle Nichols' version of an estate, and it contained the only dynasty she had ever built, her own name. That distinction matters for everything that follows. When wealthy families fight over property and control, the assets in question are usually inherited. Trusts funded generations earlier, stock portfolios assembled by a patriarch, real estate purchased with money that predates everyone alive in the dispute. The fight over Nichelle Nichols was different, because the thing under dispute was not ancestral wealth. It was the life she made, the house, the memorabilia, the convention income, the NASA legacy, the licensing of her image and her name. All of it originated with her. All of it depended on the continued management of her public identity, and all of it would become contested terrain when she could no longer manage it herself. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Nichols maintained a schedule that would have exhausted a woman half her age. She appeared at Star Trek conventions regularly, often multiple times a year, and her presence at those events was not ceremonial. She engaged with fans personally, signed autographs for hours at a stretch. posed for photographs, and participated in panels where she told and retold the stories that had become foundational to her legend. The King conversation, the NASA years, the first interracial kiss on American network television with William Shatner, the letters from young black girls who told her Uhura had changed what they believed was possible. She reprised the role in multiple Star Trek films. She lent her voice to animated projects and video games. She gave interviews, accepted honors, and continued to advocate for diversity in space exploration long after her formal NASA affiliation had ended. The convention circuit alone generated significant income: appearance fees, autograph sales, photo opportunities, and for an actress whose original series residuals were minimal at best, that income was not supplementary. It was the engine that kept her financial life running. There is a particular kind of American fame that operates this way. The public celebrates the icon. The icon, meanwhile, is still working, still showing up, still standing for hours at signing tables, still performing warmth and accessibility for crowds who want to touch a living piece of television history. Nichols was not living off a trust fund or a corporate dividend. She was living off her own continued visibility, which meant that her health, her presence, and her cognitive capacity to show up and be recognizably herself were not just personal concerns, they were economic ones. As long as Nichelle could walk into a convention hall and be Nichelle Nichols, she had an income and a life. The moment she could not, the entire financial and social architecture of her world would depend on whoever was managing her affairs. And whoever was managing her affairs would hold, in practical terms, the keys to everything. By the late 2000s, that question, who manages Nichelle, had already begun to generate tension. Gilbert Bell entered her life around 2009, initially as her manager. By his own later account, their relationship became close enough that Nichelle invited him to move into the guest house on the Woodland Hills property. He described himself as someone who ran her professional life, booking convention appearances, managing travel, handling correspondence and scheduling, and who also shared in her daily domestic routines, meals together, drives to appointments, television in the evenings, the kind of overlapping personal and professional proximity that blurs every line between employee and companion and family. To hear Bell tell it later, in filings and in public statements, he was the person closest to Nichelle Nichols for nearly a decade, and his presence in the guest house was not transactional or mercenary. It was intimate, invited, and essential to her well-being. Kyle Johnson saw a different picture. Kyle, Nichelle's only child, born from her brief marriage to Foster Johnson, had his own relationship with his mother. Complicated, as relationships between famous parents and their adult children often are, shaped by years of watching her belong more visibly to the public than to him, and marked by the kind of distance that fame creates even between people who love each other. He had grown up largely in the orbit of her career, and his public profile was modest next to hers, but he was her son. He was her blood. And as her health began to shift in the middle of the 2010s, Kyle became increasingly alarmed about the people surrounding her, their access, their influence, their proximity to a woman whose ability to evaluate those relationships was diminishing in the ways that the convention photographs did not show. In June of 2015, Nichelle Nichols suffered a mild stroke. She was 82 years old. Publicly, the recovery was framed as encouraging. She was resting. She was responding well. The prognosis was positive. Privately, the stroke was the first undeniable medical rupture in a life that had been defined by vitality and endurance. Later court filings would describe her condition as moderate progressive dementia, and at least one physician's report submitted in connection with conservatorship proceedings described significant cognitive impairment. The stroke did not end Nichelle Nichols' public life. She would continue appearing at events, continue being photographed with fans, continue inhabiting the role the country needed her to play, but it cracked the foundation. The architecture she had spent decades building, the house, the career, the income, the public identity, was now sitting on ground that was shifting beneath her, and the people closest to that ground could feel it moving. For a few years after the stroke, the two Nichelles, public and private, still overlapped enough to sustain the illusion of continuity. Convention photographs showed a woman who looked present, warm, iconic, But inside the Woodland Hills compound, the household dynamics were tilting towards something the photographs could not capture. Belle was there daily. Kyle was watching from a distance that was narrowing. Fawcett, a close friend and later a vocal advocate, was maintaining her own relationship with Nichelle and forming her own conclusions about what was happening around her. And Nichelle herself was becoming less able, incrementally and then noticeably, to arbitrate between the people who claimed to love her and the people who claimed to be protecting her. Categories that were, depending entirely on whom you asked, identical or irreconcilable. There was no neutral party. There was no one in the house who did not have a stake. The public did not know any of this. The public knew Uhura. The public knew the woman Martin Luther King Jr. had urged to stay on television. The public knew the NASA recruiter who had helped change the composition of the astronaut corps. What the public did not know was that inside a house in Woodland Hills, a house lined with the artifacts of a boundary-breaking life, roses in the yard, guest house occupied, memorabilia on every wall, the woman who had spent a lifetime representing the future was quietly losing her grip on her own present. And the people around her were beginning to position themselves for the question that dementia always eventually forces into the open. Who speaks for her now? In May of 2018, Kyle Johnson answered that question by petitioning Los Angeles Superior Court for conservatorship over his mother. The filing argued that Nichelle was suffering from dementia and was vulnerable to undue influence by individuals in her orbit. It did not name Gilbert Bell specifically in the initial petition, but the subtext was unmistakable to anyone who understood the household dynamics. Kyle believed that someone, or several someones, was exploiting his mother's diminished capacity, and only the authority of the state could intervene effectively. A judge granted temporary conservators that same month, appointing a professional fiduciary alongside Kyle to oversee Nichelle's person and estate while the court evaluated the full picture. Nichelle's sister, Marion Smothers, attended at least one of the early hearings, the family drawing together around a legal process that none of them had anticipated and all of them would come to be defined by. The temporary order was supposed to stabilize the situation. It was supposed to protect Nichelle, while the court determined what permanent arrangement would serve her best. What it actually did was transform every relationship in her life into a legal question. Who could visit? Who could manage her finances? Who could remain on her property? Who could schedule her convention appearances? Who could speak on her behalf? These were no longer matters of affection or personal trust or decades-long intimacy. They were matters of court-approved authority, and the person who ultimately held that authority would hold, in every practical sense, the keys to everything Nichelle Nichols had spent a lifetime building. The hearing stretched across months. Fawcett pushed for continued access, arguing that Nichelle had preferences and relationships and a sense of her own life that a conservatorship should not simply erase because her cognition had declined. Bell's position grew more precarious with every filing. He was living in the guest house of a woman whose son was petitioning the state for total legal control, and the arguments being made to the court were increasingly hostile to his continued presence. The judge, Barbara Johnson, weighed medical evaluations, reviewed financial records, heard from family and professionals, and confronted the question that haunts every conservatorship involving a beloved public figure. At what point does protection become possession, and who gets to decide where that line falls? At one stage, the judge herself voiced concern about the cost of the proceedings. A signal, noted in reporting, that even the court could see this process might consume the estate it was supposed to protect. On January 24, 2019, Judge Barbara Johnson named Kyle Johnson the permanent conservator of Nichelle Nichols' person and estate. The ruling was unequivocal. The legal authority over Nichelle's life, where she lived, who could see her, how her money was spent, how her affairs were managed, how her name was used, and now belonged to her son. Nichelle was not in the courtroom when the order was entered. She did not testify. She did not raise an objection or express a preference or speak a single word into the record. Whether that absence reflected her incapacity or strategic advice from lawyers or simply the procedural reality of how conservatorship cases proceed in Los Angeles County, the effect was the same. The woman whose entire public life had been built on visibility and voice was not present for the legal moment that redefined both. The conservatorship did not settle the battle, it armed one side of it. Kyle now had the law behind him, and every person who had been part of Nichelle's world before the court order was now standing on the other side of a legal boundary that had not existed 6 months earlier. Bell was still in the guest house, but his right to be there was now a question for Kyle's attorneys, not a matter of Nichelle's invitation. Fawcett was still advocating for Nichelle's preferences, but those preferences were now legally subordinate to a conservator's judgment. The convention income still needed managing, the house still needed maintaining, the memorabilia still sat on the shelves, and Nichelle herself was now, in the precise vocabulary of the California probate system, a protected person, which meant her own wishes, to the extent she could still form and articulate them, carried legal weight only insofar as her conservator chose to honor them. She was 86 years old. She had spent a lifetime enlarging the national imagination, and the legal system had just decided that her own life required someone else's signature. What happened next would make the conservatorship look like the quiet part. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw. And we're just getting started. Within months of the January 2019 ruling, the conservatorship battle did what conservatorship battles always do when the underlying relationships are fractured and the stakes are both financial and emotional. It escalated from legal proceeding into open warfare, conducted simultaneously in courtrooms and in public, and it did so with a velocity that left almost no one around Nichelle Nichols untouched. The recording surfaced first. In May of 2019, audio emerged, circulated through TMZ and attributed to Gilbert Bell, of Nichelle Nichols screaming during what was described as a confrontation involving her son Kyle. The sound was not ambiguous. It was not a raised voice, captured mid-argument or a moment of routine irritation. It was terror, an elderly woman audibly distressed, in a situation she could neither control nor understand, her voice cracking at a register that conveyed not anger but fear. The recording landed in the entertainment press and then ricocheted through fan communities and social media, because the voice belonged to someone the American public associated with composure, authority, and an almost preternatural grace. This was not Uhura on the bridge, calm amid phaser fire. This was not the woman who had stood next to astronauts and told young scientists the future was waiting for them. This was someone screaming in what should have been the safety of her own life. And this scream carried the full weight of everything the conservatorship had tried to resolve and had instead made worse. The exact circumstances of the recording were contested from the moment it appeared. Bell's side presented it as evidence that Kyle was aggressive toward his mother, that Nichelle was frightened in his presence, and that the conservatorship had placed her in the custody of someone she feared rather than trusted. Kyle's side characterized the release as a calculated act of manipulation, a moment taken out of context by a man who had his own reasons to undermine the conservatorship, weaponized through celebrity media for maximum damage. What was not contested by either side was the sound itself. Whatever had provoked it, whatever had happened in the room before and after the recording device captured those seconds of distress, the undeniable fact remained. Nichelle Nichols, 86 years old, cognitively impaired, legally under the protection of the state of California, had been recorded in a moment of abject panic, and that recording was now available to anyone with an internet connection and a passing curiosity about what had happened to the woman who played Uhura. There is something about that moment worth understanding beyond its evidentiary value. The recording did not prove what either side wanted it to prove. It proved something worse, that Nichelle's private life had deteriorated to the point where the moments of fear and confusion were being captured, stored, and strategically deployed as weapons in a proxy war fought in her name, but conducted entirely over her head. The moral contamination was comprehensive and inescapable. Even if Bell released the audio out of genuine alarm for Nichelle's safety, the act of releasing it through a celebrity tabloid turned her distress into content, clickable, shareable, stripped of context by design. Even if Kyle's conduct in the recording was defensible, when the full circumstances were understood, the mere existence of the audio meant that his mother's worst moments were no longer private property. They belonged to the public record now, to entertainment reporters and Twitter commenters and anyone who wanted to use a famous woman's scream to confirm a narrative they had already chosen. The conservatorship was supposed to shield Nichelle from exploitation. Instead, it had created a battlefield where every intimate moment, every bad day, every frightened sound, every interaction between caretaker and charge that went wrong in the way that interactions between declining elderly people and their overwhelmed families always go wrong, could be repackaged as ammunition in someone else's argument. The system had not protected Nichelle from being used. It had created new and more efficient ways of using her, and the legal machinery kept grinding. In 2019, Bell filed suit against Kyle Johnson in a dispute rooted in the guest house, the property, and his access to Nichelle and her affairs. The specifics of Bell's claims centered on what he described as his rightful place in Nichelle's life and household. A place he argued had been sanctioned by Nichelle herself, maintained for nearly a decade, and now being destroyed by a son who was using court authority to eliminate a rival rather than to protect a mother. Bell framed himself as a displaced intimate, a man who had devoted years to the care and management of a woman who had wanted him there, who had invited him into her home and her daily life, and who was now unable to speak up as the son she had kept at greater distance dismantled the arrangements she had made. Kyle's response came in 2020, and it was not a rebuttal, it was an escalation. The countersuit alleged elder abuse, negligence, fraud, theft, and infliction of emotional distress. A catalog of accusations that painted Bell not as a devoted caretaker and manager, but as someone who had systematically positioned himself inside a vulnerable woman's life for the purpose of financial extraction. Kyle's filings describe Bell's years in the guest house not as a relationship of mutual care and professional partnership, but as a slow-motion exploitation. A man who had gained access to Nichelle's home, her finances, her convention income, and her public identity, while her cognitive decline made it progressively harder for her to recognize what was being taken. Bell's side, responding through legal filings and public statements, alleged that Kyle himself had engaged in threatening and intimidating conduct, that the conservatorship was being wielded as a tool of isolation and control, and that Nichelle's own expressed wishes were being overridden by a son whose authority derived from a court order rather than from the trust of the woman it governed. Neither side's account can be taken as established fact in a narrative like this, and the script should not pretend otherwise. What can be observed is the shape of the conflict and what it reveals about the people trapped inside it. Two men, one a son, one a former manager, each claiming to be the person who truly cared for Nichelle Nichols, each accusing the other of being the person who was actually destroying her. And between them, a woman whose own voice had been effectively silenced by the same illness that had necessitated the legal intervention in the first place. The mutual accusations did not cancel each other out. They compounded the tragedy because they demonstrated that the people closest to Nichelle had become so invested in their own versions of the story that the woman at its center had ceased to function as a person in the argument and had become instead a claim, a possession whose ownership was contested, a resource whose management was disputed, a symbol whose meaning each side insisted only they could properly interpret. Every filing consumed money. Every attorney's hour was billed against the estate. Every motion, every counter motion, every discovery request, and deposition and court appearance drew down the financial reserves that the conservatorship was theoretically designed to protect. The legal system that had been invoked to safeguard Nichelle Nichols' interests was also, with grinding efficiency, spending her estate on the process of arguing about who should be in charge of spending her estate. The judge's early concern about costs, noted in reporting on the conservatorship proceedings, had been prescient. The process was consuming the thing it was supposed to preserve. And then the house itself entered the fight as something more than a backdrop. The Woodland Hills property, the home Nichelle had purchased in 1982, the cul-de-sac sanctuary she had filled across 4 decades with the physical evidence of a career that had mattered, the roses, the oversized furniture, the guest house where Belle had lived, the neighboring lot acquired in 1994, became one of the central dramatic objects of the dispute. Reporting on the conservatorship repeatedly described the home as contested terrain, and subsequent coverage indicated that Kyle, exercising his authority as conservator, moved to sell the property. The decision provoked immediate and vocal criticism from Nichelle's friends and associates, including Angelique Fawcett, who argued that the house was not merely a real estate asset to be liquidated on a balance sheet. It was the physical center of Nichelle's identity, the place where her life's work was archived and displayed, where decades of career memories lived on the walls, where the NASA awards sat alongside the Star Trek photographs, where the roses she had tended grew in the yard she had walked through 10,000 mornings. Selling it, Fawcett and others contended, amounted to dismantling the world Nichelle had built around herself, and doing it while she was still alive but unable to protest. Whether the sale was financially necessary, strategically sound, or emotionally devastating depends entirely on which framework you bring to the question. A conservator managing an estate under the pressures of litigation, medical costs, and ongoing professional fees might reasonably conclude that a property worth significant money in the San Fernando Valley real estate market should be converted to liquid assets to fund the care obligation the court had mandated. From Kyle's position, the house may have been an anchor dragging the estate toward insolvency. From Fawcett's position, and from the position of friends and fans who had known Nichelle in that house and understood what it represented, the sale was an act of erasure performed under the cover of fiduciary responsibility. The last tangible connection to the life she had curated being dissolved by someone who had the legal authority to do it, but not, in their view, the moral standing. The house mattered so profoundly in this story because it was the one thing that made the conservatorship visceral and concrete. Court orders are abstracted language. Legal authority is invisible. Fiduciary responsibility is a concept. But a specific house on a specific street in Woodland Hills with specific photographs on the walls and specific roses in the specific yard is a thing you can touch and walk through and remember. When Fawcett argued that Nichelle should remain in Woodland Hills, she was not primarily making a legal claim. She was making a human one, that a woman's home is not interchangeable with any other safe location, that the place where you have lived for nearly 4 decades is not fungible with a room somewhere else, and that removing someone from the geography of their own accumulated life is a particular kind of violence, even when it is executed with court approval and defensible intentions. Fawcett's role throughout this period deserves the attention it rarely received in headlines because she represented something the legal structure of a conservatorship has never adequately known what to do with. The friend. She was not family. She was not a paid professional fiduciary. She was not an attorney or a therapist or a court-appointed guardian. She was someone who knew Nichelle Nichols, who cared about her as a person rather than as a legal category, and who believed that Nichelle's own preferences, her desire to stay in her home, her affection for certain people, her discomfort with certain others, still mattered even after a court had determined she could not manage her own affairs. Fawcett pushed for visitation rights. She argued publicly that Nichelle was being isolated from people who loved her. She challenged the operating assumption of the conservatorship as Kyle administered it, that protection required a narrowing of access so severe that it functioned in practice as confinement. Her position raised a question that the American conservatorship system has never satisfactorily answered and probably never will. What happens to a person's chosen relationships when legal authority over their life is transferred to someone else? Nichelle had spent decades building a network of friends, colleagues, managers, admirers, and collaborators. Some of those relationships were professional. Some were deeply personal. Some were complicated and perhaps unhealthy and perhaps exactly what she wanted anyway. But they were hers. They were the relationships a free adult had chosen to maintain. And once the conservatorship formalized Kyle's authority, the question of which relationships Nichelle was permitted to maintain became a decision made on her behalf by someone whose own relationships with the people in question range from indifferent to openly hostile. Fawcett kept pushing against the narrowing. The system kept filtering access through Kyle's judgment. And Nichelle, the person whose preferences were supposed to be at the center of every consideration, was less and less able to articulate what those preferences were. The window was closing. Everyone could see it closing. And the arguments about who should be allowed through the window before it shut consumed whatever time and energy might have been spent simply sitting with her. By mid-2020, the tightening became geographical. Kyle petitioned the court for permission to relocate his mother from the Woodland Hills home, or from whatever living arrangement had replaced it, into New Mexico, where he and his wife lived. The stated rationale was practical and, from a caregiving standpoint, reasonable on its surface. He could provide more direct oversight in his own community, closer to his own home, with support resources he could manage personally rather than coordinating across hundreds of miles. The move would allow him to fulfill his obligations as conservator without the logistical burden of managing his mother's care from another state. From the perspective of everyone who had been fighting to keep Nichelle in the life she knew, the petition was the final move. New Mexico was not Woodland Hills. New Mexico was not the San Fernando Valley. New Mexico was not the convention circuit, the memorabilia-filled rooms, the cul-de-sac where roses grew, the geography in which Nichelle Nichols had been Nichelle Nichols for the better part of 40 years. New Mexico was, for the purpose of this story, a destination that represented the completion of a process that had begun with a court filing and would end with a woman living in a place where she had no history, no community of her own, no independent connections, and no one to see her except the people her conservator allowed through the door. In August of 2020, a judge approved the move. The approval was procedural. The court evaluated whether the relocation served the conservatee's interests and concluded that the conservator had made a sufficient case. There was no dramatic courtroom clash. There was no 11th hour intervention. There was a motion, a review, and an order. The bureaucratic language was antiseptic. Approval, transfer, relocation. The human reality was not. By November 1st, 2020, Kyle Johnson's attorney told a Los Angeles County judge that the move had been completed. Nichelle Nichols, 87 years old, suffering from progressive dementia, the subject of active and unresolved litigation in Los Angeles, was now living in New Mexico. Kyle's attorney also indicated his intention to transfer the conservatorship to a New Mexico court, completing the jurisdictional migration of her case from the state where she had spent the heart of her professional and personal life to the state where her son had settled. The process was legal. The process was approved. The process followed the procedures that California law provides for exactly this kind of situation. And the process resulted in an 87-year-old woman being separated from the last physical remnants of the life she had built. The move was reported in local and entertainment media, but it did not generate the kind of sustained, organized public outrage that might have prompted institutional review. Nichelle Nichols was famous, but she was not Britney Spears. There was no hashtag campaign. There was no congressional inquiry. There was no army of fans camping outside a courthouse with handmade signs. The conservatorship proceeded according to its own internal logic. And that logic, like however well-intentioned, however legally defensible at each individual step, produced an outcome that should disturb anyone who pauses long enough to see it clearly. A woman who had spent a lifetime as one of the most visible Black women in American popular culture, whose entire public identity was built on presence and voice and the refusal to be invisible, was now living in a small city in southwestern New Mexico where almost nobody could see her at all. The cultural machinery, meanwhile, kept processing Nichelle's story with its own logic. In 2022, ABC aired an episode of Who Do You Believe?, a true crime adjacent series that presented dueling narratives of disputed events and devoted it to the conflict between Kyle Johnson and Gilbert Bell. The episode was titled Protector versus Predator, and that framing and the forced binary, the demand that the audience choose a side, the reduction of a complicated human situation to a televised verdict, was itself a symptom of what had gone so deeply wrong. The real story was not a clean binary between a hero and a villain. It was a situation in which every person involved had reasons and grievances and partial truths, and in which the perspective that mattered most, Nichelle's own, could no longer be provided by the person who held it. But entertainment television requires narrative structure, and the structure it imposed was adversarial. One of these men protected her, one of them preyed on her, and the audience was invited to render judgment from their living rooms. Nichelle herself had become, in the grammar of that kind of programming, a subject rather than a speaker. Her story was being narrated by others. She was not telling it. She had not been able to tell it for years. Silver City sits in the foothills of the Pinos Altos Range in Grant County, population roughly 10,000. It is a former mining town with a quiet downtown, art galleries, and the kind of unhurried pace that draws retirees and people who want distance from metropolitan noise. The air is clean. The mountains are close. It is by most measures a pleasant place to live a quiet life. It is not a place that has anything to do with Nichelle Nichols. There are no convention centers in Silver City. There are no studio lots or talent agencies or entertainment industry infrastructure of any kind. There are no walls lined with photographs of a starship bridge. The distance between Silver City and Woodland Hills is roughly 800 miles by road. The distance between the life Nichelle had built in one place and the circumstances she was living in the other was something no map could measure. The final stretch of Nichelle's life is not well documented in the public record. What is known is that she was in Silver City in the care of her son and his family, and that her dementia continued its progression along the path that progressive dementia always follows: a narrowing, a dimming, a slow withdrawal from the world that no amount of love or legal authority can reverse. The convention circuit moved on without her physical presence, though her name and image continued to circulate in Star Trek fandom with the reverence reserved for foundational figures. Fans posted tributes and remembrances, retrospectives were published and shared. The public Nichelle Nichols, Uhura, civil rights icon, NASA recruiter, the woman Martin Luther King Jr. had told to stay, continued to exist as a cultural object, a meaning, a symbol that the country could celebrate and hold up and point to as evidence of its own progress. The private Nichelle Nichols, meanwhile, was somewhere in Silver City, beyond the reach of almost everyone who had known her, living inside a disease that was erasing the very capacities, voice, presence, recognition, autonomy, that had made her matter. On July 30th, 2022, Nichelle Nichols died in Silver City, New Mexico. She was 89 years old. Her son Kyle announced the death publicly, describing it as a passing from natural causes. The announcement was brief and measured, a son informing the world that his mother was gone. The response was enormous and immediate and entirely focused on the symbol. NASA issued a tribute celebrating her recruitment work and the generations of astronauts her advocacy had helped bring into the program. Star Trek cast members, producers, and franchise representatives published statements praising her as a trailblazer, a pioneer, a woman who had changed what American television looked like and what the American future could include. News organizations around the world ran obituaries built on the familiar architecture of her public legend, the barrier-breaking role, the MLK encounter, the NASA recruitment campaign, the cultural icon who had shown a country what it meant to imagine Black women into the stars. Social media filled with photographs of Uhura, composed, uniformed, seated at her station on the bridge. A vision of dignified professional competence projected into a fictional future that had, in many ways, become real precisely because she had been there to represent it. The morning was vast and sincere and entirely organized around the public Nichelle Nichols, the one the country had needed and loved and was now losing for good. What the tributes did not address, what tributes are not designed to address, was the texture of the years immediately preceding the death, the conservatorship, the screaming on the recording, the lawsuits and countersuits, the guest house dispute, the sale of the Woodland Hills home, the friend who had fought for visitation rights and been filtered through a legal structure that could not tell the difference between protection and isolation, the move to New Mexico, the money spent on litigation, the narrowing of a world that had once been defined by its expansiveness, the conventions, the NASA events, the decades of fan interaction, into a small circle of family care in a small southwestern town. The country honored Nichelle Nichols as she had always been honored, as a symbol of progress, of aspiration, of what America could be when it chose to imagine generously. But the country did not reckon with the conditions under which that symbol had spent its final years, because reckoning with those conditions would have required acknowledging that fame and reverence and cultural importance provide no protection whatsoever against the ordinary catastrophes of aging, illness, and the terrible question of who gets to decide what happens when a person can no longer decide for herself. Nichelle Nichols was gone. The fight over her life what it had meant, who had protected it, who had exploited it, what the system had done to preserve it, and what the system had consumed in the attempting was not. The tributes faded within weeks, the way tributes always do. The obituaries cycle out of the news. The social media posts about Uhura gave way to the next thing the internet decided to care about. The country had mourned a symbol, sincerely, generously, with the particular warmth Americans reserve for cultural figures who remind them of their own capacity for progress. And the mourning was complete, and the country moved on. What did not move on was the legal and institutional wreckage that Nichelle Nichols' final years had produced. The unresolved lawsuits, the disputed estate, the competing claims of people who had spent years arguing about who had loved her more and who had harmed her worse, and who deserved, now that the woman herself was gone and the only thing remaining was her name and her money and her legacy, to be the custodian of what was left. The litigation between Kyle Johnson and Gilbert Bell did not end with Nichelle's death. Death ends a life. It does not end a lawsuit. The claims survive the person they were filed on behalf of, transferring from the individual to the estate, and the estate becomes the new client, a legal fiction that continues to incur fees, generate motions, and occupy courtroom time long after the human being at its center has been buried or cremated or, in Nichelle's case, partially sent into space. Kyle's elder abuse countersuit against Bell, the one alleging fraud, theft, negligence, and emotional harm dating back to Bell's years in the Woodland Hills guest house, remained active in the Los Angeles County court system after July 2022, a proceeding that now concerned a dead woman's assets rather than a living woman's welfare. The shift was subtle, but the distinction mattered. When Nichelle was alive, the conservatorship and the lawsuits could at least be justified as instruments of protection, however vigorously that justification was contested. With Nichelle gone, the litigation was stripped of its caregiving rationale. What remained was money, property, and the final accounting of who owed what to whom. The months after Nichelle's death did not produce the kind of swift reckoning that the public narratives around conservatorship abuse sometimes promise. There was no dramatic courtroom revelation. There was no confession, no vindication, no moment where a judge looked at the assembled evidence and said clearly and for the record, here is what happened to this woman, and here is who was responsible. Instead, the legal process did what legal processes do when the emotional fuel that launched them has been exhausted, but the procedural machinery is still running. It ground forward slowly, expensively, and with diminishing returns. By October of 2023, court reporting indicated that the legal battle between Kyle Johnson and Gilbert Bell had been placed on hold. The procedural term for this is a stay, and in practice, it often reflects one of several realities: financial exhaustion on one or both sides, a strategic pause while other matters are resolved, or the quiet recognition that continued litigation will produce nothing worth the cost of pursuing it. The stay was not a resolution. It was a pause, and pauses in litigation are often the precursor to abandonment rather than settlement. The legal system had been running on the momentum of the original conservatorship dispute, and that momentum was dissipating. The person whose welfare had justified every filing and every fee was gone. The adversaries remained, but the cause that had given their conflict its moral urgency had been removed by death. Bell's trajectory in the aftermath traced an arc that was grimly familiar to anyone who has watched people caught on the wrong side of expensive litigation without the resources to sustain it. By the time the case resurfaced in public reporting, Bell had filed for bankruptcy, a legal filing that in practical terms limited what Kyle's lawsuit could recover, even if it reached a judgment in Kyle's favor. The man who had spent nearly a decade as Nichelle Nichols' manager, who had lived in her guest house and described himself as the person closest to her, who had released the recording of her screaming that had turned her private distress into a tabloid headline, who had sued Kyle and been countersued in return. That man was now insolvent. Whatever the full truth of his years with Nichelle, devoted companion or systematic exploiter, or, as is almost always the case in these situations, something tangled and human that refuses to fit neatly into either category. The financial outcome was stark. The decade of proximity to one of the most famous Black women in American popular culture had not made Gilbert Bell wealthy. It had made him bankrupt. The guest house was gone. The management role was gone, the access was gone, the money was gone. And the legal system that had been asked to adjudicate his relationship with Nichelle Nichols had produced no verdict, no finding, no formal determination of what he had been to her or what he had done. By late 2025, reporting confirmed that Kyle Johnson had ended the litigation against Bell. The precise terms, whether there was a settlement, a dismissal, a mutual walkaway, and were not publicly detailed in the coverage available. But the practical effect was clear. The lawsuit that had defined the public narrative of Nichelle Nichols' final years, the adversarial proceeding that had consumed estate resources and generated entertainment press headlines and fueled a television episode and kept two men locked in mutual accusation over a woman who could not speak for either of them, was over, not resolved, not concluded with the kind of finding that would allow anyone to say, with authority, what had actually happened. Over in the way that litigation often ends when the cost of continuing exceeds the value of any possible outcome, through attrition, through the exhaustion of resources and will, through the quiet recognition that the legal system had taken everything it was going to take from both sides and had given back nothing that resembled justice or clarity or peace. There is something about that ending, an ending that is really just an abandonment, a cessation, rather than a conclusion, that captures the deeper futility of what the courts had been asked to do in this case. Over the span of 7 years, the legal system had been summoned to protect Nichelle Nichols, to determine who was exploiting her, to adjudicate custody of her person and her property, to evaluate competing claims of devotion and abuse, to approve the sale of her home, to authorize her relocation across state lines, and to manage the aftermath of her death. Thousands of pages of filings, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees billed against an estate that had been built by a woman who earned her living one convention appearance at a time. And at the end of all of it, the system had produced no definitive accounting of what had happened to Nichelle Nichols during the years when she was most vulnerable. No one was found guilty of elder abuse. No one was formally cleared. The litigation simply stopped, the way a fire stops when it runs out of things to burn. The participants were older and poorer. The estate was diminished. And the central question, who had served Nichelle's interests and who had served their own while claiming to serve hers, remained exactly as unanswered as it had been the day Kyle first walked into the Los Angeles Superior Court to file for conservatorship. The legal afterlife did not end with the Bell litigation. In 2025, Nichelle Nichols' estate, still managed by Kyle, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Gila Regional Medical Center in Silver City, the facility where Nichelle had received medical care before her death. The lawsuit alleged medical negligence, claiming that the hospital had failed to properly diagnose and treat conditions that contributed to her decline and ultimately to her death in July 2022. The specific clinical allegations were detailed in court filings and concerned the standard of care Nichelle had received in the community to which she had been relocated, the community her conservator had chosen, the community the court had approved, the community that was 800 miles from the medical infrastructure of Los Angeles. Whether the wrongful death lawsuit succeeds on its merits is a separate matter from its significance within the pattern of Nichelle's story. What the suit represents is another iteration of the same fundamental dynamic that had governed her final years. Someone connected to Nichelle's estate, alleging that an institution charged with her care had failed to provide it adequately. The conservatorship had been filed because Kyle believed people around his mother were exploiting her. The elder abuse suit had been filed because Kyle believed Bell had harmed her. Now the wrongful death suit was filed because Kyle believed the hospital had been negligent. Each filing reflected a genuine concern about Nichelle's welfare. Each filing also reflected the limitations of a system that can assign fault and calculate damages and apportion liability, but cannot answer the question that actually haunts the people left behind. The question that hovers over every aspect of this story like weather that will not break. Could it have been different? Not the death itself. Death comes for everyone, and Nichelle was 89 and had been declining for years. But the texture of the ending, the isolation, the distance from the home where the roses grew, the years consumed by legal argument rather than simple, unhurried presence. Could there have been a version of Nichelle Nichols' final chapter that did not look like this? That question extends beyond Nichelle's individual case into the broader American conversation about conservatorship that her story belongs to. even if it never received the public attention that conversation sometimes generates. In 2021, the year Nichelle was living quietly in New Mexico while the lawsuits continued in Los Angeles, the Britney Spears conservatorship case exploded into national consciousness and prompted congressional hearings, legislative proposals, and a public reckoning with how easily the legal system could be used to control a famous woman's life under the banner of protection. Nichelle's case shared structural DNA with Spears, a beloved public figure, declining autonomy, family members and associates fighting over access and authority, a legal apparatus that empowered one party and disempowered the person at the center. But it never generated the same mass mobilization. Nichelle was older. Her decline was medical rather than psychiatric in the public framing. Her fan base, though devoted, did not have the social media infrastructure of a pop star's following. And so her conservatorship proceeded without the external pressure that might have forced the system to examine itself. The machinery worked as designed. Whether the design itself was adequate to the human situation, it was governing is the question Nichelle's story leaves on the table. The cultural afterlife of Nichelle Nichols, meanwhile, split into two currents that moved in entirely different directions and illuminated, by their divergence, the central contradiction of her story. One current commodified the conflict, the ABC Who Do You Believe? Episode had already, during the final months of her life, turned the conservatorship battle into entertainment programming, a televised format in which viewers were invited to choose between protector and predator, as though the complexity of a real woman's declining years could be resolved by audience participation. That kind of afterlife serves the machinery of content production. It takes suffering and converts it into engagement metrics. It does not serve the person, and it did not serve Nichelle. The other current was faithful to who Nichelle Nichols had actually been and what she had actually accomplished during the decades when her choices was still her own. After her death, a portion of her cremated remains was included in a memorial spaceflight, carried beyond the atmosphere on a mission alongside the ashes of other notable figures, including Gene Roddenberry himself and several of the actors who had shared the bridge of the Enterprise with her. The mission launched on a trajectory that would carry the remains into deep space, past the orbit of the moon and outward, away from the planet where she had been born in Robbins, Illinois, and had died in Silver City, New Mexico, and into the void she had spent decades arguing should be open to everyone who had the talent and the will to enter it. For a woman who had stood in NASA recruitment films and told young engineers and pilots that space was not reserved for one kind of person, who had personally helped recruit the astronauts who shattered the barriers her fictional character had been the first to imagine breaking. The journey was not a gesture. It was a completion. Nichelle Nichols had spent her public life arguing that the future belonged to everyone. Now she was traveling into that future, in the only form left to her, alongside the man who had created the show that started everything. The symmetry was almost unbearable in its precision. The woman who had changed, who was allowed to go to space, was finally going herself, past every boundary that could be crossed, and she would never know it. And then, in 2025, came the announcement that extended her legacy in the direction she had always cared about most. A Nichelle Nichols Space Camp for Girls was scheduled to launch in 2026, designed specifically to encourage young women, particularly young women of color, to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and space exploration. The camp drew a direct, unbroken line from the work Nichelle had done with NASA half a century earlier to the generation that would inherit the mission she had championed. It was the kind of legacy work that takes a person's name and attaches it to something alive, not to a legal filing or a tabloid story or an episode of true crime television, but to classrooms and laboratories and launch pads and the faces of girls who would learn, because of a program bearing her name, that the Starship was still hiring and still wanted them. The space camp could not undo the conservatorship. It could not give Nichelle back the house on the cul-de-sac or the roses or the walls full of photographs. It could not answer any of the questions that the legal system had spent 7 years failing to answer. But it could carry forward the part of Nichelle Nichols that had nothing to do with property disputes and guest house litigation and contested recordings and court-approved relocations, the part that had changed the country's sense of who belonged in the future, and that no conservatorship or countersued or bankruptcy filing could diminish. The divergence between these two afterlives, the one that packaged her suffering for entertainment and the one that extended her mission into the next generation, is perhaps the most instructive detail in the entire story. The country had two available frameworks for remembering Nichelle Nichols. The conflict framework turned her into a character in someone else's drama, an object of pity and speculation, a case study in conservatorship abuse or conservatorship necessity, depending on which side you chose. The legacy framework turned her into a symbol so luminous that the complications of her actual life could be filed away, irrelevant to the larger meaning she represented. Both frameworks were easier than sitting with the unresolved, uncomfortable, deeply human truth that a woman who had spent a lifetime representing possibilities spent her final chapter inside a system that was simultaneously trying to protect her and consuming her, and that no one involved, not Kyle, not Bell, not Fawcett, not the judge, not the attorneys, not the hospital, had been able to stop both of those things from happening at the same time. For those who remained, the years after Nichelle's death carried different weights and different silences. Kyle Johnson emerged from the conservatorship and the litigation as the primary steward of his mother's estate, the person most visibly connected to her legal and public afterlife, the man who had announced her death to the world and who continued to act on her behalf through the wrongful death suite and whatever other estate matters required attention. He had been conservator, spokesperson, litigant, and son, roles that overlapped in ways that made it impossible to evaluate any of them in isolation. Whether his years as conservator had been an act of genuine protection that saved his mother from exploitation, or an exercise of authority that narrowed her world beyond what her condition strictly required, or, most honestly and most likely, some irreducible combination of both that resists the clean categories the legal system and the public prefer, is a question the record does not resolve, and that this story will not pretend to resolve either. What can be said is that Kyle bore the weight of the decisions, the petition, the hearings, the move, the lawsuits, the public accusations, and that carrying that weight for years while your mother is declining and the world is watching is not a burden anyone volunteers for lightly. Bell survived in the aftermath as the former manager whose years in the guest house had catalyzed the conservatorship and whose litigation with Kyle had shaped the public narrative of Nichelle's decline. His bankruptcy marked the financial terminus of a chapter that had begun with him moving into Woodland Hills at what he described as Nichelle's invitation. The question of whether that invitation was freely given by a woman in full command of her judgment or influenced by a dynamic that was already shifting toward dependency and exploitation is one more thing the legal system processed for years and resolved not at all. Belle is not a villain in this story, just as Kyle is not simply a hero. They are both people who were close to a famous woman during the years when her ability to evaluate and manage her own relationships was failing, and the system that was supposed to determine the difference between love and predation determined nothing. Fawcett remains important less for any headline than for what her losing battle revealed about the architecture of conservatorship itself. She had argued that Nichelle should stay in her home. Nichelle did not stay. She had argued that friendships and preferences should be honored even inside a conservatorship. The conservatorship did not honor them in the way she had wanted. She had argued that removing Nichelle from the geography of her own life amounted to removing her from herself. The move happened anyway. Fawcett represents the limits of chosen intimacy when legal authority and biological family align. The reality that decades of friendship grant no standing, that caring about someone does not entitle you to access, and that the conservatorship system treats blood and court orders as the currencies that matter, not affection and not history, and not the accumulated understanding of years spent in someone's life. The Woodland Hills house, the home purchased in 1982, filled across 4 decades with photographs and memorabilia, and NASA artifacts and roses and the evidence of a career that changed American television, no longer functions as Nichelle Nichols' home. It is an address. The memorabilia that once lined its walls went wherever estate assets go, when attorneys and conservators and courts are managing the disposition. Whether those objects, the Uhura photographs, the fan gifts, the NASA awards, the physical record of a life that mattered to millions, are archived or stored or sold or scattered, is not a matter of accessible public record. The guest house where Belle lives stands or does not stand. The roses grow or do not grow. The cul-de-sac continues to exist at the end of a street in the San Fernando Valley, and the life that once filled the house at the end of it is gone. Nichelle Nichols is gone. She died at 89 in Silver City, New Mexico, far from the home she had lived in for nearly 4 decades after years of legal proceedings she could not have fully understood or meaningfully participated in. Kyle Johnson is the custodian of her estate and whatever legal matters it continues to generate. Gilbert Bell's litigation with the estate is concluded, his bankruptcy filed, his years in the guest house reduced to a set of allegations that were never tried to verdict. That's true. Angelique Fawcett remains the voice that argued most persistently for something the system could not accommodate, the idea that a diminished person's preferences and relationships still deserve weight. A space camp bearing Nichelle's name opens in 2026, carrying forward the work she cared about most. And in the foothills of the Pinos Altos Range, 800 miles from the cul-de-sac in Woodland Hills where the roses grew, the small southwestern town where Nichelle spent her final years remains what it was before the story brought her there. A quiet place with clean air and mountain views that had nothing to do with her until a court order and a conservator's judgment made it the last geography of her life. The country knew how to honor Nichelle Nichols. It honored her for 60 years. As Uhura, as the woman King told to stay, as the NASA recruiter who opened doors the space program had kept shut, as the living proof that representation on a screen could change who walked through a real door. What the country did not know how to do, and what no amount of tribute or retrospective or memorial spaceflight can retroactively fix, was protect the woman inside the symbol when age and illness and the competing claims of people who said they loved her collided in the rooms where she actually lived. She spent a lifetime enlarging the national imagination. Her final years reveal how small a famous person's world can become when protection and possession start to sound the same. When a guest house becomes a contested territory, when a house full of memories becomes an asset to be liquidated, when a court order becomes the only voice a woman has left, and when the roses she planted keep growing in a yard she will never walk through again.